Hello, today I'm speaking to you from a boat cruising along the banks of this beautiful river valley. What river am I on? Well, in fact, this is not a river from the Czech Republic, despite having travelled from Prague. This is not the river Vltava, which runs through the centre of Prague, nor is this the river Labe, which runs through the north of Bohemia. Actually, this is the river known as the Dunaj in Czech, the Donau in German, or the river Danube in English. It is an extremely hot day in the middle of July, so I will try not to melt by the time this video is over. But what has brought me to the bright and beautiful Danube today, actually it is the famous Prague writer Franz Kafka. Kafka died 100 years ago this summer, and so I've gone to find the building in which he died. Kafka is one of Prague's most famous literary icons, and the traces of his life are all across the city today. There are plaques on many walls of the buildings which he lived in. As well as 2 museums and a statue in the Jewish town. Born into a Jewish family, which encouraged him to speak and write German, Kafka was not always overly happy in this city. Nonetheless, it was the case that Kafka spent a large majority of his life living in Prague, where he worked as an insurance agent. Still, this was the base which he used to do his writing, and despite his mixed feelings, he struggled to let Prague go.
Achtung, eine Stationsansage. Wir werden in wenigen Minuten in Spitz anlegen. Fahrgäste, die in Spitz aussteigen, werden gebeten, sich zum Ausgang zu begeben. Restaurant. Achtung!
We are now in Spitz, the center of the Wachau region. With its Renaissance and Baroque buildings and the pretty square in front of the late Gothic church, the old wine-growing town invites one to take pleasurable walks. In Spitz, wine grows in the middle of the town, around the 1000-Eimer-Berg, the mountain of 1000 buckets. It owes its name to wine growers boasting that every year they harvested 1000 buckets of wine, which translates into something wine buckets, the unit of measurement used by wine.
Achtung!
But regardless of all this, it was not in Prague where his life ultimately came to an end. It was here in Austria, not far from the river Danube, and that is why I've travelled here today. Kafka struggled for 8 years against an outbreak of tuberculosis, which ultimately overwhelmed him in the summer of 1924. His family sent him to Austria in the hope the doctors might save him, but sadly they were unable to prevent his death. He visited 2 sanatoria, one large place called Wienerwald and a clinic of the main hospital in Vienna. Then, when that wasn't working, he was sent to a private sanatorium, and at the start of June, he succumbed to his disease. In my hands here, I have a small collection which is some of the last short stories which Kafka wrote. This collection is called A Hunger Artist, and my little edition here comes from the publisher's Twisted Spoon Press. Kafka completed the last of these stories in March 1924, and the collection was published not long after his death. This collection therefore contains Kafka's final short story, which is entitled Josephine the Singer, or The Mousefolk. As the title might suggest, Josephine the Singer, or The Mousefolk, is about a singer called Josephine, and Josephine is also a mouse. Josephine is an extremely popular singer for her people, and the mouse folk gather in large numbers when she decides to sing. The mouse folk are an odd people, partly childish, partly cunning, and constantly living in fear when their mouse tribe is attacked. Sometimes Josephine's concerts put them into direct danger because the mice become vulnerable when gathered together in large groups. But the story twists and turns as we carry on reading through it, not unlike the river Danube, which twists and turns as we meander along. One of the major twists is that the story's narrator declares that Josephine is not actually a very good singer. It is not overly clear whether she is even singing, or if she is whistling, or perhaps piping, as is written in some translations. And the narrator even declares that any one of the mouse people can sing just as well as her, if not even better. It's a little bit strange, isn't it? And what are we to make of this final contribution of prose fiction which Kafka wrote? He chooses to depict an artist, something he considered himself to be, but that artist is not very good, at least according to the narrator. The narrator tries to suggest why Josephine might be popular, perhaps because she demonstrates to the audience the rudiments of singing, an incompetent naivety which is almost charming, or because her concerts offer a rare moment of peace amongst their lives. Is this a biographical gesture, a humble act of self-effacement by which Kafka tried to undermine his own writing, his art? Well, we can't really prove this. After all, Kafka was not aware that this would be his final story. He probably hoped that he would survive. Added to which, while Josephine commands a large, mousy audience, within Kafka's own life, he hardly had an audience at all. Nowadays, Kafka's stories are known all over the world, but this fame only appeared in the decades after his death. During the time when he was alive, he only published a handful of stories, and the 3 novels he worked on never saw the light of day. So it's a bit of a stretch for us to say conclusively that Josephine's art of singing was meant to represent Kafka's own art. Meanwhile, the only opinions which we can form on her singing are relayed second-hand through the narrator who offers us this tale. The narrator themselves is a strange character, oddly assured, oddly dogmatic, and hard to totally trust. Yet we remain, as readers, entirely dependent on this narrator, who offers their own assessment on the quality and function of Josephine's art. Ultimately, one of the most important dynamics which the story of Josephine's singing highlights about the essence of art is that often the artist is dependent on an audience who dictates the final outcome of their work. In the same way that our opinion on Josephine is hidden beneath the interpretation of her narrator, her existence as a singer amongst the mouse people is dependent on the community which keeps her work alive. It is the mousy people which nourishes her singing and sustains it, and who also appears to subtly control how she lives her life. This same preoccupation with the life-giving relationship of an artist with their audience reappears in others of Kafka's final works. In this collection, A Hunger Artist, there is another story, also titled A Hunger Artist, from which the collection takes its name, and this story also deals with the same dynamics of artist and audience as in Josephine's tale. The Hunger Artist is quite literally an artist whose art is hunger, and who starves themselves in order to attract an audience. And after a period of 40 days of fasting, they emerge from their cage to rapturous disbelief from their audience. But once their audience loses interest in the starvation and moves on to other entertainments instead, the artist is metaphorically starved of the attention which they feed on, and then finally, literally, starves to death inside their cage. Therefore, it appeared to be a recurring interest about the artist-audience relationship in Kafka's last stories. Josephine the Singing Mouse starts to struggle with her performances, and she sustains a foot injury, although the narrator claims she is faking it. Finally, Josephine disappears, and the narrator starts to contemplate how she will be forgotten, a minor event in the history of her people. The narrator's final words are about how Josephine will cheerfully vanish and be forgotten like all her brethren. It's an unsettling moment of erasure for the end of Kafka's fiction, and if we were to try to impose some biographical reading, perhaps it feels as if Kafka is trying to come to terms with how his own work might also be forgotten. Right now, this boat is travelling along the Wachau Valley, a beautiful stretch of the Danube which is also a UNESCO heritage site, famous for its idyllic churches, towns and castles, and the high-quality wine which is grown on its riverbanks. However, just beyond here, the waters of the Danube curve in a large meander, which carries on southwards towards Vienna. It is inside this meander, in the landscape just north of Vienna, where Kafka spent his final weeks in a private sanatorium. I've organised to visit the sanatorium, which is still preserved in a similar manner to the 1920s. And here it is, Dr. Hoffmann's sanatorium, in which Kafka spent the last 6 weeks of his life. As mentioned earlier in this video, before Kafka came here, he had been staying in 2 other sanatoria, one called Wienerwald, which was just south of Vienna, and the other in the city centre, at the main hospital's laryngology clinic. However, Kafka was anxious to leave the city hospital, not least because he was watching the other patients die. When a man named Josef Schrammel, a shoemaker from the countryside, died in the bed next to him, Kafka insisted he had to get away. And so it was that he came here, to the sanatorium in Kierling, a village about 20 kilometers north of the centre. In those days, Kierling was a small village of a few hundred people. Nowadays, it has been absorbed in a larger settlement called Klosterneuburg. Kafka wanted to move here to be more amongst nature, enjoying the peaceful forests and rivers, which he could walk in if he was capable. The building of the sanatorium is still similar to the 1920s, although these days it is located next to a far noisier road. With a supermarket right next to it, and on the day we visited, a road diversion meant it was even busier than usual. Perhaps not the oasis of peace which once drew Kafka to stay here, although at the back of the building some of that peace is still retained. Inside you can see how the interior decor has not changed much, still preserving some of the atmosphere which prevailed here in the 1920s. Kafka lived on the 2nd floor, but luckily for his condition, there was already a lift installed, even 100 years ago. And still, a bit of running water. The actual rooms in which Kafka stayed are now a private apartment, but just adjacent to this there is a small exhibition, which is maintained by the Austrian Society of Franz Kafka, in order to remember the role this building played in literary history. In there you can find plenty of information, as well as recent tributes to Kafka 100 years after his death. Here we have a glass case with some reports from the time when Kafka was in the hospital in Vienna. This one here you can see is what is called a fever curve, or the curve of his fever over a few days. And as you can see, that small little numeric down there at the bottom of the graph, it says 45.6 kilograms. So even though Kafka was actually quite a tall man, he was 6'1" roughly, by the time he arrived in Vienna, he was already weighing below 50 kilograms due to his illness. During his time at Keeling, Kafka was being looked after by Dora Diamant, his third and final fiancée. Kafka notoriously broke off most of his marriage engagements, although in the case of Dora, he was determined to marry her. It was probably only because her rabbi refused to allow it that Kafka and Dora were not married in these final weeks. During this time, Dora cared for Kafka's needs constantly, alongside another of his friends called Robert Klopstock. Part of the advantage for them of the sanatorium in Keeling is that it had a small lodging where Dora could stay upstairs. During these weeks, Dora maintained constant contact with Kafka's family, even if she was yet to meet them in person herself. When writing to Kafka's sisters, she was more honest about the situation. When writing to Kafka's parents, she tried to reassure them with a bit of hope. Many of his friends came to visit him during his stay at Keeling, including his close friend Max Brod and his younger sister Ottilie. It has now been discovered that the journalist Milena Jasenska also came to visit during these final weeks. Milena was another of Kafka's past love interests, famous for the passionate letters which she exchanged with him in 1920, and a recording from her partner at that time, Mr. Franz Xaver Schafgotsch, mentions how Milena also came to see Kafka in Keeling. And out here we have a balcony which looks out on the garden behind the building. As you can see, it's a very beautiful spot. There are trees, forests, there's even a little river down by the forest there, and this is the view which Kafka would have had from his own balcony on the back of the building. So the apartment he was staying in is just around the corner from here. It's now a private apartment where someone else is living. And even though Keeling is now a more developed town, this is still an oasis of calm and peace in the middle of the city here. It is indeed beautiful down here, and if you can handle the summer mosquitoes, then there is still a pleasant riverside walk at the bottom of the garden. Increasingly, however, Kafka would not have come down here. As the weeks in Keeling continued, it became clear he was not getting better. One day before he died, on the 2nd of June 1924, he wrote to his parents, trying to assure them he was okay, although he did recommend that they postpone any visit, as he was not looking good, and he was only allowed to whisper to them. Despite these hopeful reassurances, the next day, on the 3rd of June, his laryngeal tuberculosis overcame him and claimed his life. What then followed was an expensive train ride of his body back to Prague and a burial in the new Jewish cemetery in Prague 1 week later. Kafka is perhaps one of the most famous historical victims of tuberculosis, a disease which has afflicted humanity for millennia. Nonetheless, we should not forget there are so many victims of this terrible disease who will not be remembered at all. The Italian writer Claudio Magris describes a visit with his friend to Keerling and how they read through the register of other unknown names of tuberculosis patients who were admitted to Wienerwald on the same day that Kafka was admitted there. Olga Kraus, Bianca Kovac, Etelka Kishvaludi, names now lost to history, unremembered by the rest of the world. Meanwhile, we can neither forget how the disease which killed these people is still extremely prevalent in many parts of the world. We might think of tuberculosis as a historical illness, or at least that might be its perception in the Western world, one which killed many artists in an earlier part of history: Kafka, Chekhov, Chopin, John Keats. To be fair, in Western societies it is far less prevalent, because in the 100 years since Kafka's death, we've developed combined methods of antibiotic treatment which are capable of treating many cases. Nonetheless, tuberculosis remains a major health problem in less developed parts of the world. In fact, in 2022, it was estimated that 1.3 million people still died globally from TB. Therefore, that year it was the second most deadly infectious disease in the world, second only to COVID-19.
In relation to this, it is worth mentioning the recent work of the American writer John Green, who has started advocating to raise awareness of how tuberculosis remains prevalent all around the world. And John Green analyses how this ongoing prevalence owes something to unequal access to healthcare around the world. You should definitely check out a video here on YouTube in which he digs a little bit deeper into this topic. It is a long-form documentary posted on the channel Crash Course entitled The Deadliest Infectious Disease of All Time. At this point, I'd like to give a little shout out to Matt, one of the customers on my book-related tours of Prague, who drew my attention to the work of John Green while we were discussing Kafka's own illness. If you are curious about the tours I do in Prague and you are planning to visit the city sometime soon, then check out the other videos on this channel to get a sense of what those are like. There's a link to the tour's website in the video description, and please like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed this video.